Hi everyone, Reverend Caleb Rendell here, and this is your video for Acts chapter 7. Whew! Chapter 7 is kind of a lot, as the kids say, extra. So, chapter 7 is all about Stephen, who we just met in chapter 6. And chapter 7 immediately follows the events of 6. Like there's no break in the action. It's the same moment, the same episode. And in chapter 7, Stephen gives a long, very thorough speech to the council of the high priest and everything that he has been brought before. And in this speech, he recounts most of the narrative of the main story points of the Hebrew scriptures. We're going to not go through all of it kind of point by point. You can read more on your own, but we're going to kind of hit the highlights here of what all is in Stephen's speech and then talk about the main point that comes at the end. Okay, so in verses 2 through 16, Stephen recounts the main thrust of Genesis, chapters 12 through 50, and it leaves a lot out, but here are some of the major points. So it starts out by talking about how God called Abraham out of where he was, or the Chaldees, Mesopotamia, modern day Iraq, to go to the promised land so that Abram or Abraham's descendants would live in that land. And you can find that story starting in Genesis chapter 12. That's where the sort of historical narrative of Genesis kind of starts with characters and times and places and stuff like that. Then the action skips over a lot and talks about Joseph and Joseph's brothers and the whole drama in Egypt with Pharaoh and all sorts of things and a famine. And you can find that in Genesis chapter 37, also chapter 42. But that entire thing is covered in all of 12 through 50. So if you haven't read Genesis in a while, there's a lot in there. Stephen touches on the main things and leaves out a whole lot of the details because he has a lot to say. Then verses 17 through 29 talk about Exodus 1 through 2, which is the origin story of Moses that you find in like 10 Commandments, Prince of Egypt. By the way, Prince of Egypt, great movie. Always worth a watch. It's just super good. Okay. In verses 30 through 44 are the events from Exodus chapter 3 with the burning bush and Moses being called to go back to Egypt to help bring the people out of slavery. Verses 35 through 38 are about Exodus chapters 7 through 19. Again, Stephen is taking a lot and compressing it down into just a few words. And that is the Exodus from Egypt. Verses 42 through 43, Stephen quotes from the prophet Amos, not one of those books of the Bible, one of the prophets we hear a lot about, but Amos 5:25 through 27 is what makes up verses 42 through 43. In verses 44 through 48, that covers a large amount of time, mainly talking about the residents of the people's worship. And it talks about the tabernacle, which was a tent that went with the people. And that's what they used until the first temple was built by Solomon, coming after David. And you can find the story of David's thoughts and Solomon and building the temple at the very end of 2 Samuel, but also then into 1 Kings. And then the rebuilding of the temple after it's first destroyed is things that you find later on in the history of the Bible. Now, in verse 49, Stephen quotes from Isaiah 66:1. So he's drawn on a whole lot of things. There are a lot of history from the Torah, from Genesis, from Exodus, talking about the temple, got a few words from Amos, and then this random quote from Isaiah 66, verse 1. Now, that's a lot. And what is Stephen's point in all this? Why is he recounting all this story that everyone there knows? Everyone there knows these stories. They're familiar with the scriptures, the prophets, the Psalms, all of this. Why is Stephen telling it? Well, we don't know. Stephen doesn't exactly tell us, but I think it's reasonable to guess that Stephen's point in telling all this is starting in verse 39. Stephen talks about how the ancestors, the religious leaders are the leaders of the people going back centuries, that they keep messing up despite everything that God did. He mentions the golden calf, that after the people are brought out of Egypt, out of slavery with Moses, Moses goes up to the mountain, gets the 10 Commandments and the law. While Moses is gone, the people get impatient and they tell Aaron, hey, make this golden calf. And you can find all that in Exodus. And Stephen's saying, we're still, you all more so, are still doing those things. God is doing this thing. This thing has happened through Jesus. The Holy Spirit worked in the past. The Holy Spirit is working now. And you are opposing it. You're doing these things to keep the things from God happening, just like our ancestors did. And this is a common thing that Jesus does too in the Gospels. Throughout the Gospels, you can see Jesus talking to the same religious leaders, saying, hey, our ancestors killed the prophets, and now you're here, and you're doing the same sort of thing. You're following the same pattern of saying you got everything figured out, and you don't. And as a religious leader, you're really supposed to be on board with, what's going on with God, and you're not. And Jesus would call the religious leaders, hypocrites, you brood of vipers, whitewashed tombs, all those sorts of things. And we see what happened to Jesus. Got him killed. Now he's Jesus, so he comes back. Unfortunately, after Stephen's speech in verses 54 through 60, the same thing happens to Stephen. They get enraged at Stephen, and this time since Stephen is not near as famous or well known as Jesus, they do not have to go through the bureaucratic process of going to the Roman governor, which of course is Pontius Pilate, and going through all that process. There was the dog, by the way. I think you saw just a little bit of the dog's tail there. She's tired of listening to me talk about Stephen. Hope you're not. But anyway, since Stephen is not near as famous as Jesus, there hasn't been a whole lot of publicity around him. He hasn't been building a following or anything. They just go out and kill him. They drag him out, and they stone him because they can. And what are they gonna? Who's gonna stop them? Nobody. They just kill him. Now, while this is going on, Stephen, just by the power of his convictions and the Holy Spirit, is very Christ-like. He looks up to heaven, he sees God and Christ, and he then has these words, very similar to words we hear from Jesus on the cross, where Stephen says, do not hold this sin against them, similar to Jesus saying, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. In this case with Stephen's, they very much know what they're doing, but Stephen still says, do not hold this sin against them. Whew, a lot. A lot happens here in Acts chapter 7. A lot of history is told, and then some horrible, tragic violence. Now, to close this video, there is one mention of someone who is super important. This is the first time we hear of someone named Saul. Now, we don't get a lot of details right now about Saul, just that he is there for the stoning of Stephen. And it says that they come and they bring their coats to him. We don't get the details of what exactly that means, but we know that Saul is there. He's not intervening. This may mean that Saul, had some sort of logistical or administrative role and just kind of like, hey, I got to keep track of people's stuff, so I'm helping in this process somehow. Okay. Now, remember Saul. He is going to be very important later on. You may know him by another name, but I am not going to give away that spoiler. So just remember, we encountered Saul here at the end of 7 with the stoning of Stephen, because that is going to come back. All right. So a lot going on here. Take a walk, get some fresh air, drink some water, do something to take care of yourself, because chapter 7 here is a lot to take in. Again, if you ever have any questions, send me an email. My email's coming up right after this. So thanks for watching, friends. Take care, and the story continues in Acts chapter 8.